consuming SOAP web services. Now we're going to flip from REST to SOAP and talk about how you can call SOAP services in Mule. SOAP support in Mule is based on Apache CXF, and CXF is a web services framework in Java for SOAP messaging. It handles the serialization and deserialization of these messages and will handle all SOAP envelopes and namespace processing. The key with CXF is that the developer only has to focus on the POJOs or the Java objects and not so much on the SOAP XML envelope and its structure. Now, for the consumption of SOAP web services, if you do have to connect to a web service, the first thing you check, once again, is whether there's a connector out there. No need to call a SOAP service directly if you're using something like Salesforce that has a great connector backing it. But if there's not a connector and you want to call that SOAP service, you can use Web Service Consumer. What Web Service Consumer does is it feeds in the WSDL for that web service, and then the rest you can configure. Things like host, port, address, and operations will be just inputted for you, and you can then go in and configure anything outside of the Web Service Consumer. And the Web Service Consumer, as you'll see, will even provide some metadata to the rest of the flow. If you need more features or more specific things with your actual client, you can also use the CXF component. And this will allow you to not only consume web services, but also to expose an endpoint as a SOAP service. And let's get into consuming our first web service. Walkthrough 7.4, consume a SOAP web service. We will create a new flow that can call a SOAP web service. We will use a web service consumer endpoint to consume that SOAP web service, specifically Delta flight data. And then we'll use DataWeave to transform the XML response into that JSON structure that we're kind of canonicalizing around for the MUA Flights API. Let's get started. Okay, first we are going to head to our student files, and inside of our student files, let's open up these snippets. Inside of Module 7, you'll notice right below the United RESTful Web Service, there's info about a Delta SOAP service. We're going to copy that URL that includes the WSDL at the very end. Once you've got that copied, let's head to Postman, and let's use Postman to make a request to this specific WSDL. When Postman gets a response, you're going to notice a bunch of XML data coming back. Let's scroll through some of the information. So this WSDL, or descriptor of the SOAP web service, is going to provide us details about things we can call, such as find flights and list all flights. As we scroll down, we can see some data about what the body of information coming back in our response would be. If we were sending lots of fields out, we'd be able to see that as well. And again, we can see things like our methods, list all flights, find flights, and so on. So let's see how we can use this WSDL, or descriptor of the SOAP web service, inside of Studio. We'll make sure, again, this URL is still on our clipboard, and we'll return to Anypoint Studio. Let's now introduce a third flow by dragging another HTTP listener into the project. We'll start off by renaming the flow, making sure we don't forget this time, which will be the Get Delta Flights flow. And at the beginning of the Get Delta Flights flow, we'll select our HTTP listener. As usual, we'll use the existing config. The path in this case will be Delta, and the allowed method will be get. Now, a slightly different change. Instead of dragging an HTTP requester in, we're now going to bring in the web service consumer and drag that into the process phase. And for the connector configuration, let's go ahead and head to our global XML inside of here. And in the global XML, under global elements, we will hit create. And let's put in web service consumer, creating a new web service consumer global config. With web service consumer set inside of here, we can paste our WSDL location in. Then it should parse that WSDL and populate the service port and address. If it doesn't right out of the gate, you can try just hitting reload WSDL, or you could go into the dropdowns and try to choose the service first and so on. But overall, you should end up with a service port and address quite similar to this. Let's also rename this to make sure it's easy to identify. We'll call it the Delta Web Service Consumer, and let's hit OK. We'll save up our global XML, and now we've got the Delta Web Service Consumer in place. We'll go to the implementation XML inside of here, and return to our web service consumer request that we had been setting up. We can see Delta Web Service Consumer is now selected. In the drop-down for operations, we can hit List All Flights. And now we should be able to make a call to the List All Flights. Looking pretty good. So inside of our flow, let's go ahead and place a logger at the very end of it here. So we have a place to break. We'll put a breakpoint on Web Service Consumer. And let's go ahead and debug this project. Once the project has started up successfully, we will return to Postman. And in this case, we'll make a slightly modified request to our normal local host. We're going to do the Delta. And with Delta inside of here, we're going to take the query parameter out for now and just hit send. Now that should get us on our breakpoint in Anypoint Studio. We will step over Web Service Consumer onto the logger, and you'll see a WS Consumer namespace stream reader show up. Now, similar to the stream we saw with the HTTP request, a little pro tip is you can also do message.payload as java.lang.string. If you do want to preview this while it's still inside of the Mule runtime, that'll give us a string printout of all the data. You, of course, copy and paste that elsewhere to look at it a little bit more cleanly. But just a quick debugging trick we can use to look at this payload set. We can now step forward to send the response back to our client. And back inside of Postman, we've got legitimate XML being returned to us from our SOAP service. So we are officially calling a SOAP service. But we want our API to be very standard, very canonical, if you will, which means this data needs to be JSON, just like all of our other requests are. So let's return to Anypoint Studio, and between the logger and Web Service Consumer, let's drag in a transform message element. We will double-click on transform message. Once again, DataSense does its magic. It knows from the Web Service Consumer's context exactly what the XML structure is on the left. We'll once again define metadata on the right and choose the flights_JSON just as we had before. We'll then hit select, and now we are doing our first mapping coming out from XML into JSON. So let's try to do very similar fields as we had seen before. We'll bring airline name over to airline, code to code, departure date to departure date, destination to the to airport, empty seats respectively over to empty seats, origin to the from airport, plane type to plane type, and then price to price. Now with these changes in place, you can see a slightly different structure in the code area. This is actually pretty similar when you think about it from what we had before, just a couple small subtleties that we'll get into deeper when we talk more about data weave, because we are going from XML to JSON in this case. This time, let's save everything up and let's just run this project now that we've made our mapping from XML, hopefully, into our standard JSON structure. You guessed it, once the application starts up, we're just going to head in and make the exact same request to Delta, in which this case we should see this great JSON body come back, exactly as all our other requests were. So now you can see how easy it was, based on a WSDL, to reach out to a SOAP web service. We just popped the data weave transformer in there, and we're able to translate that quite easily over to the same JSON structure as all of our other calls. And now we're already supporting calls for Delta, United, and American. Looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and flip back to slides and take a deeper look at web service calls via Web Service Consumer.